Thanksgiving is the holiday that begins the annual time for families to get together and catch up with each other. Tell stories of all the adventures that they have been through since the previous Thanksgiving. Some traditions include watching the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, play football, or watch football, and of all else, eat way too much until we hit a food coma and take a nap on the couch by the bay window where the sun comes in and hits our body just right for that post dinner nap before dessert. Thanksgiving is one of the most heavily traveled holidays of the year. In recent past, not so much now, there would also be people who'd camp outside of Best Buy waiting on the Black Friday TV deals. Now you see Black Friday deals starting in the beginning of November or even at the end of October. Thanksgiving 2009. Four people murdered in a massacre during Thanksgiving Day dinner. Traditions of sharing dinner together and then joining in the family ensemble around the piano. Who would do such an unthinkable act during such a holiday where you're thankful for your family? It wasn't just a random act of violence of an unfortunate family. The offender would plot this day for 20 years. This is the Campfire Crime Chronicles, a true crime podcast, and this is the case of the Thanksgiving Family Massacre. Welcome to the Campfire. I am your host, Kevin. Thanks for joining me around the campfire this Thanksgiving in Central Florida. If you already had Turkey Day dinner and getting ready for your food coma, or if you're on your way to dinner and getting ready for the food coma, we are diving into this holiday murder of four members of a family in Jupiter, Florida. I love you now and will forever. Words of Paul Marriage on his high school yearbook page that he dedicated to his whole entire family. Born in Miami, Florida, 1974, Paul Marriage was the older brother to his two twin sisters, Lisa and Carla. In his younger life, Paul battled severe depression as well as obsessive compulsive disorder, and would have a nervous breakdown at the age of 19 while he was attending the University of Miami. According to documents and someone who was close to the family, Paul was around the age of 13 when he would have an argument with his siblings where during the argument he would pull a loaded gun out and threaten to kill the entire family. This could be associated to his mental illness. Even though no one was injured in the altercation, it's unclear how Paul even acquired the gun in the first place. I wasn't able to verify in the timeline where this fits. However, I know it was prior to 2006 before a restraining order request from Carla had made. But Paul would seek out a protection request from police from one of his sisters, but would be reported that he would drop the request a few weeks later. The request was initially made because Paul would accuse his sister of trying to kill him. In 2006, Carla Marriage would also make a request for a restraining order against Paul, also stating that he would threaten to kill her along with himself. Now, there was another statement in a report that Paul had threatened to cut her throat and then commit suicide. However, there's no verification between the reports that it was the same incident or if they were two different incidents. However, just like her older brother, she would also withdraw the request just a few weeks later. This would be the prelude of a very dark future. Speculation would be that the restraining order would cause resentment between Paul and his sisters. During Thanksgiving of 2009, 35-year-old Paul Marriage would be on the phone with his father, Michael Marriage. He would tell his father that he was on the way to dinner, but needed directions to the house. According to Paul's parents, Paul was anxiously talking about the holiday dinner to his parents and never actually committed in attending until he called his father that evening about attending after the dinner had already started. Jim Sutton, who was a photojournalist for WPTV, would say in a report that he had never heard anything negative about Paul. Jim had only met Paul once or twice and hasn't seen him in more than a decade. Jim, like probably most other people, would respond that Paul was family and didn't have a problem with Paul attending unexpectedly last minute. Although not invited, Paul would be welcomed into the cousin's home. It would be told that when Michael made the announcement that Paul would be attending, Paul's mother, Carol, would have the most chilling, darkest thoughts and would tell her daughter, Lisa Knight, that she hoped that Paul wasn't coming over to kill them all. Lisa, who was one of the twin sisters of Paul, would also tell her mother that she had the same thought but would tell her not to tell Michael since it would probably upset him. Dinner had already started when Paul arrived. According to reports, Paul sat quietly at the table, not saying a word to anyone, nor would he eat anything. After dinner, they would go over to the piano, where 6-year-old Michaela would sing the Nutcracker as an impromptu type of rehearsal for her performance that she was supposed to be in the following day. There wasn't any information given on what kind of performance it was for other than that it was a performance of sorts. 6-year-old Michaela would also be joined by Lisa Knight, who also enjoyed singing. While the two were singing, Patrick Knight, Lisa's husband, was sitting next to Paul, and the two would talk about Michaela singing to everyone and would tell investigators later in a report that he was sitting next to Paul while they were around the piano and never noticed any red flags. He would go on to say that it was your typical family holiday dinner where everyone was enjoying the company of everyone, and it was a humbling and wholesome experience. Now, this is where some of the reports differ from others, so I'm going to give you both reports. The shooting started around 10 p.m. that night. One report would say everything would be fine up until the goodbyes. Patrick would be outside with the younger adults of the group, while the older adults were still inside. While Patrick was outside with Carla and Paul, he would tell them that they were going to head out with being tired, and Paul would tell him that they should hang out for a little bit longer. However, Patrick would insist on leaving since it was starting to get later and they were tired. Patrick would just be waiting outside for Lisa to come outside, and then they would leave. Then at that moment, Patrick would recount in a report that that's when Paul drew a gun out, and he doesn't remember who he shot first. However, he would shoot Carla and then place the gun to Patrick's forehead. It's unknown how Patrick avoided being shot in the head. However, Patrick would still be shot, just didn't know the seriousness of the injury. It would be reported that Patrick would bring Carla inside and lay her on the floor between the kitchen and the living room. However, Paul was already inside. At first, Patrick believed that Carla had a gun in her purse and it had misfired, as he would hear Jim tell everyone to back up that there was a gun. However, he soon realized it was Paul with the gun. Now, the other report would say that Paul would go outside to get his gun, and then would return inside and begin shooting everyone, as everyone was still inside. Regardless, Patrick was shot and injured. Carla, one of Paul's sisters, was shot and killed. Paul would shoot his 79-year-old aunt, Raymonde Joseph, in the shoulder, where she would then fall to the floor. Raymonde's husband would attempt to stop the bleeding from Paul shooting his aunt, and then Paul would just come over and hold the gun to her chest and would fire the gun again into her sternum. Then, while Paul was reloading his gun, Paul would look over at his father and tell him, I quote, "I've been waiting 20 years to do this." After that statement, he steps over Carla's body and walks toward Michaela's room, where he enters her room to find her sleeping and shoots her once, and before leaving the bedroom, he returns back to Michaela to shoot her 2 more times. While Paul was inside the bedroom, Jim was outside the bedroom window trying to break the window to get Michaela out of harm's way, but was unsuccessful. What kind of monster shoots a 6-year-old while she is sleeping peacefully in bed? Jim would run to his neighbor's house asking if he had a gun because there was a shooter in the house. However, the neighbor did not. Before Paul would leave, he would attempt to take 2 shots at his uncle. 1 bullet would graze him, and then the gun was reported to have jammed. Police would arrive to the house and secure the scene. Once medics would arrive, they would check those that were shot and find 4 fatalities. Then, when they came to the half-conscious Patrick laying on the floor, the medic that checked him would say that they had one and would rush him to the hospital. The 4 that were found to be deceased were 6-year-old Michaela, Paul's twin sisters, Carla Marriage and Lisa Knight, who was pregnant, and Paul's 79-year-old aunt. Once Paul had left the house, he fled and vanished, where the manhunt would begin. Police would put out an APB on Paul's car as well as a description of Paul. Paul was driving a blue 2007 Toyota Camry with a rear spoiler on it. The TV show America's Most Wanted would also air an episode about Paul Marriage and what he had done on Thanksgiving night. 6 days after the murders, Paul checked into a hotel in South Florida on December 2nd, 2009, under a false name of John Baca, with a false home address as well. This at the time being unknown to authorities. Jupiter PD would notify Michigan authorities about Paul because 3 months prior to the murders, he was treated by a physician in Detroit, although it was never released what Paul had been treated for. From a report on December 19th, 2009, police would offer a $100,000 reward for information leading to Paul's apprehension. It wouldn't be until January 2nd, 2010, when police would catch up to Paul in the Florida Keys and find him held up at the Edgewater Lodge in Long Key, where the owners of the hotel contacted police after recognizing Paul from an episode of America's Most Wanted that aired Paul Marriage and the murders he committed against his family. When police spoke with the owners and employees of the hotel, they would tell them that Paul was extremely private and wouldn't let them clean the room and would only come out of the room to do laundry. When authorities raided the hotel room, Paul was on the computer and it was reported that he ran into the bathroom to hide. After some time, he eventually would come out of the bathroom with his hands in the air and would plead for his life with authorities before being taken into custody. Paul would be charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder. Paul would be dubbed the nickname as the Thanksgiving Day Killer. When authorities searched the hotel room, they would find suicide devices inside his room, which consisted of a cord tied in a noose, helium tanks, along with a plastic hood and rubber hose. Along with his suicide devices, authorities found 5 cell phones along with his laptop. Authorities would bring Paul back to the Palm Beach County Jail. Experts would say that Paul was not insane, but rather he was a sociopath. They made the argument that he would perceive to love his family, who knew that killing was bad, but he just didn't care. So the question then becomes, how does this 35-year-old who was third in his class with honors, as well as a varsity athlete at a prominent Miami prep school before attending the University of Miami? Also, putting in his high school yearbook would say, "I love you now and will forever," go to killing 4 of his family members and telling his father, "I've waited 20 years for this." Even former classmates of Paul's had good things to say about him, and that the Paul they knew never acted like this in school. His football coach had all positive things to say about him as well, that he pushed himself and did a lot of practicing on his own. Another classmate would say that he was always confident and had plans to attend University of Miami. So what changed? According to reports, it would start with the breakdown that he had at 19. It was believed that he never overcame, or that the breakdown never really ended for Paul. Paul would also be suffering from insomnia. According to experts, mental illness conditions will often come out or intensify in college, or any pre-existing condition of mental illness. With the added stress from the life change, it can become overwhelming for someone dealing with mental illness, and that different mental disorders can lead into violence, which was a statement made by Kevin Beaver, a professor at Florida State University. It's not a sudden turn, however, it's a gradual turn, which is a statement made by Dr. Stephen Alexander. It's speculated that with Paul's OCD and mental illness, that he was never able to make decisions or hold a job. Then when he looks at his sisters and their success, he became jealous of their success. That's just speculation, however. There's no confirmation of this. It is believed, though, that there was some sort of resentment there between him and his sisters. Also, if we remember back earlier in the episode, he had threatened to kill his sister before in the past prior to the murders on Thanksgiving. So, after Paul was apprehended, him and his lawyers would immediately start working on an insanity defense, which is also known as a mental disorder defense. However, this strategy would be short-lived when authorities would argue that Marriage meticulously plotted and premeditated the murders, because it would be learned that Paul had purchased 4 firearms and ammunitions between 2 gun shops, that it was reported to total approximately $2,000. This was all done in weeks leading up to the Thanksgiving dinner. He would also have a scope attached to a rifle, stating that it would be used for hunting. In addition to the firearm purchases and the ammunition purchases, he would also withdraw $12,000 and purchase a cover for his car as well, and also pack all of his clothes, which would insinuate that he had all intentions of running and then go into hiding after the murders were committed. Jim Sutton would make this statement, and I quote, "If there's anyone who deserves the death penalty, it is someone who would execute my 6-year-old daughter while she is in bed." Paul's parents, who had been financially supporting him during his entire adult life, would not hire a private defense lawyer for Paul, and Paul would be represented by a public defender. On August 8th, 2011, Paul Michael Marriage would go on trial for the 2009 Thanksgiving family murders of his two sisters, aunt, and 6-year-old cousin Michaela. The trial was expected to last about 5 weeks. Patrick, Lisa's husband, was shot in the stomach and while in the hospital was placed in a medically induced coma and wasn't expected to survive. However, by the time of the trial, it was expected that he would be the star witness during the trial. The trial would be lengthy. The defense would still try for an insanity plea. However, when they were unable to get the insanity plea, Paul agreed to plead guilty in exchange for 7 life sentences rather than the death penalty. So, the motive of why Paul murdered 4 of his family members, of which included 6-year-old Michaela, is more or less speculation. As we talked about earlier in the episode, Paul was speculated to have a resentment against his sisters for their success. And it was said that he had a resentment against the other family members also, and that he became jealous of 6-year-old Michaela because of the attention that she had gotten earlier that evening while she was singing. After the trial and sentencing, Jim and his wife would go on to have 2 more daughters and would remain in the same house of which the murders took place. Jim and his wife, after the trial and sentencing, would go on to have 2 daughters. In an interview with Jim, he would state that he wasn't moving out of the house because he wasn't going to let one horrible night take away all of the wonderful memories they had with Michaela in that house. And before too long, music would start filling the air in the home again from his daughters. So that concludes this tale at the campfire. I know there is more information that I didn't include in this story, as there is a lot of information to cover. All resources used to gather the information for the case include, but not limited to, news articles, reports, documentaries, as well as other sources. I appreciate everyone who has gathered by the campfire with me for this case. Also, if you wish to listen to ad-free shows as well as bonus episodes and get a shout out on the podcast during the most recent episodes, then sign up and join me over at the bonfire. Also, if you wish to find me on social media, I'm on Instagram right now at campfire_crime_chronicles. So thank you for joining me at the campfire and have a safe and wonderful Turkey Day. Join me in 2 weeks from this Sunday for the next episode of the Campfire Crime Chronicles, a true crime podcast.